Thank you so much, Anka. It's an honor indeed for me, not only to talk to your group, but also to share a platform with Brady. I mean, truly a very humbling position here. And I should also note that we met, I think, in Berlin, in a unit there called Common Sense Geography. Well, I'm not sure how much common sense you're going to be hearing this evening, for me at least. But anyway, certainly I learned a lot from being in that group and learning from you, Anka. So it's a real privilege to be talking to your folks now. And what I want to do is not only talk about Pelagios, actually. Pelagios is going to be the hinge, the linking mechanism, but not only. What I want to get to, in fact, is talking about the present project, the links Brady and myself, which is a Pausanias Digital Periegesis project. So our interest there is mapping all things spatial and placial in Pausanias. So not only the places and spaces within Pausanias, but also thinking about the structure of Pausanias' narrative. And that's really what I'm particularly interested in, how ancient Greek narratives in particular are based, and many of them are based on spatial ideas, and they organize space in very different ways. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the way that they view the world. And just to give you an example, and it's kind of a paradoxical case, if you like, because I'm turning to a map, and a very non-classical map. This is from the medieval period. It's from the Arabic Book of Curiosities. But this is just to give you a sense of what I find interesting in, let's say, non-modern ways of viewing space. They can offer us, I think, portals into different ways of seeing. So if we were in a face-to-face environment, I would probably open the floor up to ask if people know what this space is that's being represented. We're not, so let me give the game away and show you what happens when you map it. So what we've done there is we've identified the toponym, the place name information around here, and that's what you can see with these by the clunky looking dots. And through that process of annotation, we're then able to map the map and then see, oh, actually, this map is the Mediterranean. Now, it's not the Mediterranean that we know or how we would map it. And that's already, I think, showing the potential that these non-modern documents, whether they're maps or indeed the textual world that I work in, you know, the different ways of viewing that they offer. So what I want to do is to, in many ways, as the arrows might suggest here, there's a trajectory. It's kind of how we like to imagine our careers as a nice, smooth progression from one thing to another, getting bigger and better. And there's certainly a biggerness to what I want to talk about, but these arrows are also slightly obfuscating the number of missteps, wrong turns, dead ends as well. And actually, they're the kinds of things that I also want to flag up, because I think things that didn't quite work are also kind of helpful. So what I'm particularly interested in is trying to leverage new technology, digital methods, to rethink non-modern representations of space. And we've already seen how that might work with that representation of the Mediterranean. So we're going to start off with a project that started in 2008 and ran for a few years. It was a Hestia Herodotus project, where we were looking at space and place in one narrative. Then I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about this bigger overarching initiative called Pelagios, a different beast. And I'll come back to that at the end, because it's literally transformed into a different kind of setup now. But the main focus is the Digital Periegesis, which is where my interests and Brady's align. I'll aim to speak for about 40 minutes, so hopefully that's going to leave time for questions, and of course, then we can hear what Brady has to say. But where do we start? So it's important to flag up my focus in this presentation is going to be very much on the digital aspect of the humanities. But I want to also emphasize the other, let's say, the human aspects. And in particular, with the Hestia project, that was it was a multi-disciplined, multi-pronged approach to the questions and issues of space and place in this ancient Greek narrative. So you're only going to get one element of that I'm going to focus on, but the other elements I will try to also if not discuss in detail, at least make you aware that there's other things going on. In any case, thinking about how we could possibly use digital tools for thinking about space and place in Herodotus, well, you've got to start with the digital text, of course, and we were really lucky and we're given a massive kind of a leg up from the beginning of our inquiry with the fact that there's already a pretty decent digital text online that we could not only consult, but crucially we could reuse. And by that reuse, I mean not just being able to read the English or Greek text and look at the places mentioned, but actually get that information. And we do that by clicking this button. I should have been aware by the kind of the almost red color that it's a warning button. Don't press this unless you know what you're doing. This is what you get when you press that button. It's the markup behind that, behind the text of Herodotus. But crucial for us, this we could grab from the Perseus Classical Library, and already it contained really important information that we could use. The information that we were interested in, which is to do with place. So here's the first place that's mentioned in Herodotus, Halicarnassus, and as you can see, it has all this other metadata information around it. I'm going to come back to this shortly when we talk about Pelagios. But in any case, it has all of this, a lot of the place information already encoded within it that we could grab and thus really easily visualize in some kind of web mapping GIS service. So here we have Herodotus in a geographical information system. By that I mean the place information that we could extract from the Perseus classical text. We've done a little bit of organization ourselves. We've color coded that information according to the kinds of place or spatial idea that's being conveyed. So the red dots signify settlements or the built environment. The yellow dots signify territories. The blue dots signify natural features. Now, I think there is a value to doing things like this. In addition to being able to see how many places I mentioned over the course of the narrative, that kind of thing that GIS is really good for, that kind of quantitative measures. Even with the snapshot like this, you get a sense of the intense focus around the Aegean Sea. So although we get the sense of Herodotus' histories talking about the whole oikumene, far west as the Pillars of Heracles, as far east as Susa, nevertheless, it's very much focused around what's happening. And the further away you get out, the more the red dots, those settlements, the built environment, fade away, and the more these other ways of organizing space, whether that's by territory or by physical feature, emerge. But of course, there are issues. I mean, it's okay to represent a place with a red dot, but a territory, you'd want some kind of polygon information. Anyway, what polygon information would you have in Herodotus for a concept like Europe or Asia? These are concepts that are very much under focus and in competition, in contestation in the text. And the same goes for natural features. You know, might make sense for the top of a mountain, but less so surely for a sea or for a river. So there are a lot of issues with using this technology. And I think primarily for us, the problem was it's just a static map. There's no sense of narrative space and no sense of the way in which the narrative organizes space or the spatial forms within the narrative. It's just a snapshot, a global view, a bird's eye view, not a sense of space and place from the text up. That's what we wanted to get to. So this is where, if you like, the other element of Hestia came in, which was reading the text, you know, some philology. We chose one section of the text. It's a pretty important section. It's book 5, the hinge of the narratives, when East and West come into conflict, contact and conflict for the first time. And we sat down and we went through the text very carefully using the Greek text. And what did we do? Well, the first thing we noticed was that there was a lot of spatial information that we weren't capturing or that wasn't being captured by the Perseus text. And I'll give you an example from the very opening lines there. The first place name that's mentioned, so that the first place name that we mentioned in the Perseus text is Perinthus. there's lots of important spatial information before we get to that point, not least of all in that opening line when we're told that Darius had left behind in Europe the Persians. So there's an important spatial aspect there, a Persian occupying force within Europe that wasn't being captured. So we then extended our investigation from place name to include ethonyms, peoples, and that also includes individuals as proxies for places. And it's quite important, actually, who is a proxy for what place and on what point. Darius, for example, pretty much consistently a proxy for Persia, but you only have to think of some Athenians to think of what point are they being a proxy or not. Hippias as a proxy for Athens or not. So there's some interesting questions emerge there just by virtue of us having to, if you like, organize our thinking. And the second important aspect that certainly wasn't being captured in the GIS, and it can't be captured in the GIS really, is the relational aspect of space and place. That is to say, how Herodotus is putting together the places in his narrative. And again, I give you an example just kind of at random really from book 5, where he cuts across back and forth across the Mediterranean from west to east, east to west. So he went through every clause of book 5, identifying people, places, looking at the relationships between them, using a very basic technology, an Excel spreadsheet, identifying the place for people and then the relationship, and we ended up with this. So any digital humanities talk that mentions networks or relations has to have a spaghetti monster. So here's mine, the hairball. We are dealing with complex information. You know, who knew Herodotus is complex information? This was still, nevertheless, a bit of a surprise when we pressed the button, and all that Excel, data was suddenly transformed in the Gephi into this mess. There's some head scratching. Fortunately, we able to work with some network visualization people, Scott Weingart in particular, who was able to organize. So this is basically the same information, but now visualized in a way in which we can actually make sense of it and start to notice interesting things. The important thing here is, I guess, two things. First of all, the importance of thinking about visualization and trying to, bearing in mind that you're always going to have to make choices of selection. And secondly, that the visualization isn't meant to, even though it's at one, you can think of it at one level, the endpoint. This is, we've done a lot of work to get this. It's really not the endpoint, it's the beginning. This is using diagrams such as this as a heuristic, as part of the investigative process, as a provocation really, to get us to think a lot harder about the text. Just to explain what you're looking at here, the places that are more central are those that are mentioned most often in book 5 in relation to others. So at one level, no surprise, Persia, you'd expect that, I think. Miletus, yeah, because we're talking about Ionia. And at one level, again, that's not a bad thing. You don't want total surprises when you're dealing with big data, because otherwise there's something wrong with your data. So the fact that Persia's central makes sense. But then some interesting things that perhaps we wouldn't have noticed if we didn't have that overview of the whole book and the relational aspect. For example, the prominence of this small group Pausanians, who Herodotus interestingly flags up right at the beginning of book 5. Or indeed the other cluster that emerges slightly to the right of this graph over here, which is an internal cluster between the Greeks. Sparta, almost with an exclusively unidirectional relationship on Athens, Sparta trying to intervene at an early stage of Athenian democracy. So there are interesting things, I think, to unpack here, but you have to unpack them. The graph itself isn't going to explain things. You're going to have to do the explaining yourself. All through this process, I mean, and there you see, I think, a good example of some hardcore, let's say, philology, then you leveraging some digital tools, network graphs, to then loop back into our reading. So that's, I think, quite a nice example of some low-level digital intervention. But while we were doing this, it struck us that being able to identify place naming information within a document could be very powerful, particularly when you want to compare different documents. And that really led into the Pelagios initiative. And Pelagios initiative is about using that very simple idea of places within a document. And by document here, I mean the whole raft of different things that you see on this slide. So not just text, but also databases, images, museum collections, library collections. using the idea of a place and being able to extract the place name as a way of linking. Place name is not quite right, and the method that we developed in partnership with some major players in the classical world, and then we branched out beyond the classical world. So this started off really with the German archaeological database and our friends at Perseus, is this idea of annotation. So all of these different all of the different document sources that you saw before, whether that's research databases or classical libraries or indeed museum collections, all of their data is structured in a particular way to serve those communities, to serve those particular data sets. So very difficult, therefore, to link up. But if you put a hook in the data, hook being a metadata reference to the place, an annotation of the place, that way you can have all of these different systems operating for their own communities, but they can be somehow connected to each other. That's really the Pelagios principle. So a lightweight semantic annotation of place. And the critical thing here is identifying the place in your document. So here we have Herodotus's histories. I've identified a place. I've read this character string, Thessaly, Thessaly, as a place. I made an assertion. And then the second step is crucial. I've then mapped that assertion to a central authority file, a gazetteer of the ancient world, Pleiades. What Pleiades did, and so Pleiades is an instantiation, a digital instantiation of the Barrington Atlas. But the critical thing that the people at Pleiades did was to think of places as concepts. So therefore, they attributed an arbitrary number to define and to disambiguate ancient places. So here they've given this number 1332 to describe, to define, to disambiguate Thessaly. And in fact, that's really important if you want to think of all the different Alexandrias, for example, in the ancient world, or indeed if you're looking at Athens and you don't know, it can be classical Athens, or it could be Athens, Georgia, where REM are from, which in a different context I might be interested in. So this way of using these unique identifiers, uniform resource identifiers, or as Charlotte Rouget has called them, social security numbers for places, is the Pelagios way of disambiguating and using the gazetteer authority, global authority, as the ones who are producing these URIs. With this two-step process, what you do, and here you have another little bit of code for me, is you're producing RDF, which is the language of the web for linking data. So by this means, this two-step process of identifying in your document this bit, the resource, the place, and then mapping that to the global authority file, this bit in Pleiades, that two-step process produces this triple information, which is linked data. So that's the Pelagios method. And one outcome of that, this is looking into the crystal ball, if you like, is to be able to search for information related to places. So here's our place Perinthus, as mentioned at the beginning of Book 5 of Herodotus, with a whole bunch of information here, with documents that contain some information to do with Perinthus, coins primarily, that have been found in Perinthus. This is a way of, I think, of enriching our reading of, well, really whatever you want to do, but I'm particularly interested in historiography and tragedy and epic. This is a way of enriching my reading of the places mentioned within those literary representations, to get a better sense, if you like, of those representations and of the broader cultural, political, economic context around them. But that's looking into the crystal ball, because that's, if you like, the future of linked data. And I noticed that John Prague was in the audience, and he's very much contributing to that idea of where that future might go with producing linked data. But let me just pause here to tell you a little bit about the tool that we developed in the process of that, because it struck us, after having worked with these major data resources for the ancient world, Perseus, the German archaeological database, these folks have their own digital expertise. But we realized if we expected the ordinary researcher to be contributing, there's no way we can expect them to learn code. And I'm putting my hand up here, and really I should have flagged that up from the beginning. That I'm very much a philologist. I'm not a coder, unlike, for example, Brady, who knows a little bit about coding. So I need to have something that I'm familiar with, I'm comfortable with to use. And this is the platform that we developed, Recogito, that enables you to do that process of annotation that you saw before. So here's that same screen, and this is the annotation screen. So I can simply go through this, identify the place, and then do that second bit, which is to disambiguate the place, which under the hood is producing linked data, but also I don't have to worry about that. It's what I want to emphasize here is how valuable Recogito has turned out for the broader community, not just of classicists, but anybody working on historical information, historical places. It's just how flexible it is and powerful it is for those folks to be able to use. For example, just within the Recogito framework, you can then map that information. So we were in the annotation screen before where you do your work, and then there's a mapping screen so you can see those places maps. This is now Herodotus, the places mentioned in Herodotus, with some polygon information that we're getting from the gazetteers now mapped. And you can break that down so you can visit any of those places. We've gone again back to parenthesis, and we see that this is one of 11 annotations with a snippet of the text. You can jump back to the text. You can start at least bringing text and map into some kind of relationship to each other. So you start breaking down the barriers between the two, again, to think, I think, a little bit harder about those representations. Although you still see we're in a bird's eye view. That's kind of interesting when you think about, again, maps, and how maps don't have to be from the bird's eye at all. This is another crazy looking map. This is a Portland chart. So charts that are produced from the perspective of ports and sailing along the ports along the Mediterranean. You wouldn't know this is a Mediterranean, but by annotating the map in Recogito, and that's what you're seeing with all these kind of grayed out boxes. This is toponym information, place name information that you transcribe in here and then map across to a gazetteer. You can then map it, and we discovered that that one folio was actually part of a whole series of folia that map out not just the Mediterranean, but the coastline all the way around up to Britain itself. And what I'm going to get to with the Pausanious project is the use of tags. Tags are a very powerful mechanism we find for creating a typology, for organizing the spatial information. To give you one simple example, this is from Homer's catalogue of ships, and I've used Homer's own typology, his own cataloging system, so where he talks about the different contingents as a tag. This is the download you get kind of in the CSV format, so you see what it looks like, and then you can map that, and you can map the catalogue of ships now color coded, so you get at a glance again the different contingents mapped in the catalogue of ships, and you start to see hopefully some interesting patterns, how Homer moves around, how he leaps from one place to another. Particularly of interest here, I think, are the separation here, where you have the orange dots, which represent the Euboean contingent being separated. So why are these two contingents somehow joined in Homer? So again, a provocation to go back to the source text and to read further and harder, I think. The important thing with Recogito, which is this open source, openly available tool, so anybody can use it. If you know how to code, you can fork from it on GitHub. It's as open as it possibly can be, is that it's an annotation platform. So we see it first and foremost as that's where you do your annotation. If you want to do visualization, you get a little bit, you get the map. But if you want to do visualization analytics, if you want to really explore your data, you want to get it out. So we offer this range of different formats depending on what you want to do. So for example, if you're interested in producing linked data, it has the RDF. If you're interested in a GIS, it has the GeoJSON. If you're interested in network analysis, because you can do network relations as well, I haven't shown you that. Maybe I can talk about that in the questions. You can produce the CSV for Gephi and generally the CSV files, which is your bog standard data format. So the standard formats, and is what Recogito uses. But for the last 10 minutes, if I have the time, I just want to talk a little bit about the current project that I'm working on with Brady, and that's the Pausanious project. And Pausanias you'll all be familiar with, famous description of Greece, where you start off in Attica, you move around the Peloponnese, and you end up here. Kind of a weird vision of Greece. It makes sense, but there are lots of issues too. And over and above that, as Will Hutton has I think memorably shown with this series of network-like looking graphs here, is that although this is a useful bird's eye view of the travel Pausanias makes, really when you get into the text, you're very much at the route-based view, and you really want to try to draw that information out. So not so much the bird's eye view as the moving through space view, or the hodologic, if you will. So that's what we're interested in. This is the overview, the 10 books. What you see here, where I think one issue with the Recogito visualization that we're getting here is the white dots represent crossover between books. So I think we want to think a little bit harder about how we can better visualize that information. But even so, this is again quite helpful just to show the sheer range of places Pausanias talks about. He doesn't just mention, in fact, that weird bit of mainland Greece that you just saw. He talks about very much again the whole oikoumene, in many ways traveling over the same paths that Herodotus before him had traveled over. An interesting connection, I think, when we think about really the rather different view that his text offers, which is privileging place over time. But what I want to get into are the issues that we've been having. Well, first of all, the easy bit, which was, you annotate the place and you kind of map to the gazetteer. We got that. But what about use of tags? And tags have become very important for us for trying to organize Pausanias' information. So, for example, if we're just thinking of the place entity that we're identifying, well, what kind of place is this? And here we've introduced categories that are a little bit more refined than what I had used previously in the Herodotus project. So is this part of the built environment? Is it a physical feature? Is it a region, some kind of territory? Is it a mythical place? Is it an object in space? Because Pausanias gives you such granularity. It doesn't just tell you about the settlement, but he drills down. We're going to see that's an issue in a second. Secondly, what more can you say about that? Is it a settlement, a temple? Is it an agalma, Xoranon? Trying to again use the vocabulary that the author himself uses. And then I think potentially of great interest, particularly thinking of those network-like looking graphs that Hutton was producing by hand, is thinking about Pausanias' movement through space. And this is Brady's idea, actually, was to use an additional tag, which we remark Paus, to indicate if Pausanias is talking about the monument in front of him and then moving from that monument to another. So trying to capture that sense, because as you're going to see in a second, that's not the only way Pausanias describes space, actually. There are other entities you can mark, so not just places, but people. You can also mark people. That's perfectly possible in Recogito. What you don't have in Recogito, and this is because there's a problem within the community at the minute, is that we have no authority file against which to map your particular identification. If you like, we don't have a gazetteer for people. Hopefully that's going to change. There's a conference coming up in a couple of weeks called Link Pasts, and one of the working groups there is going to be dedicated to this idea of producing, let's say, a prosopography for the ancient world, a digital prosopography that we can all use. When that comes online, that can be plugged into Recogito, and instantly it becomes a much more powerful tool. At the minute, as a hack, and again, according to what Brady had suggested, we're linking across ourselves to Wikidata, which again is a kind of community-built data resource that we're finding increasingly helpful. As I mentioned, the description is not always route-based. It's frequently an account. That's important to mark. Famously, of course, Jeanette's idea of focalization, who's speaking. We want to be able to mark whose account this is, with the potential that different accounts from different places have different ways of organizing space. But how do you mark that? And also time. Time is a great one in Pausanias. He doesn't just move through space, he also moves through time. Again, practically, how do you mark that? Where do you do the annotation? Do you mark the whole clause, which is under that particular time, or the particular temporal indicator? And how do you talk about that time anyway? I'll come back to that in a second. Another pragmatic challenge, and I've kind of already hinted at it, is the gazetteer, the authority file. Great when you're dealing at the level of settlements, not so great when you're drilling down within a settlement. And if Pausanias does nothing else, he drills down within settlements. So we don't just get Athens, of course, we also get areas within Athens, some of which do appear in Pleiades, the Kerameikos, for example, the Acropolis, some temples even, but nowhere near as many as what Pausanias is describing. So again, as a bit of a hack, we've introduced some other data resources that aren't gazetteers, but essentially are databases of important sources. Judith Binder's Art Historical Gazetteer, for example, the German Archaeological Database, and critically, Brady's Topos text that have important place information so that we can then map across, not only so that we can put these things on a map, we can put this statue on a map. That's kind of interesting. I think it will be when we're looking at the intersections of different ways of organizing space within a narrative, but also to be able to link between, or link from, if you will, Pausanias's narrative representation to external sources, not to prove Pausanias right or wrong, but rather to bring these different sources into direct juxtaposition and confrontation with each other so we can better understand Pausanias's representation. Another challenge is, okay, I'm very familiar and comfortable now using Recogito as an annotation platform, and I can annotate it as best as anybody. I can spend my whole day annotating, great. But at some point, you've got to look at your annotations and and try to make sense of them. What applications might we want to use? Well, we could use a GIS, and here we have a funky time space cube that I have no idea how that works. I'm going to have to work with our GIS expert on the team to think about the ways in which that kind of way of organizing information can help us. If we think about networks and relating entities, place entities within a text, we might want to talk to the NodeGo people who specialize in network analysis for the humanities. If we're thinking about having some kind of map visualization in the text, maybe Neatline, Omeka. But it should be noted that Neatline works great when you're dealing with, for example, the American Civil War and letters and being able to read the letters in and against the battlefield descriptions, for example. But a thick description text like Pausanias, that's going to be more challenging. Potentially very interesting, in fact, is where Perseus now finds itself. So the new Perseus Scaphiura, I've learned, which is now representing the Perseus text and the morphological information that they've been building. You can use that environment for visualizing other kinds of information, so kind of a plug-inable interface. So that might be a place to host our text, for example. And of course, Brady's Topos text will be another home for it, I think. So basically, I think what I'm saying is there are different homes depending on exactly what you're looking for. And one important home will be something like the Scaphiura or Topos text that other people can have access and can build on what we're doing. I just want to leave you, if I've got 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Actually, Anka, how long do I have? Do I have 5 minutes?
You have all the time you need.
No, you don't. You don't want to say that. Trust me, you don't want to say that. I'll spend a couple of minutes on this slide, and then literally there's one other slide that I want to talk about. So this is, well, because what I want to really emphasize is you've seen a lot of the digital stuff now. You've seen some of the pragmatic questions that we're facing as a project. But as I've learned actually from the technical developer of Recogito, Rainer Simon of the Austrian Institute of Technology, pragmatic and technical questions tend to be at their heart conceptual issues and questions. And that is certainly the case. And actually, what I really want to emphasize, which is not what you normally hear from a digital humanities presentation, is what I found is not big data and not big data and distance reading, but really the reverse, small data and close reading. And to give you an example of what I mean, this is just the opening passage of Pausanias, annotated. And what I want to do is just to flag up some of the issues. Now, of course, an immediate response is you don't need the technology to have seen this stuff, and that I totally accept that. But what I would say is that using the technology and having to think about what I mean by a particular entity, a place, whatever, has made me think a lot harder and has slowed my reading. So it's helped me to see the stuff that's there. So to give you some examples, just the opening line, it's kind of elided in the English translation, but if you go to the Greek, the place toponym information I'm extracting here, Ellinikes, Kyklades, Agaion. Notice you have before that what you might call the physical aspect of space. What we see here, in fact, is space becoming place, I think. So you have the mainland, the Greek mainland, the islands, the Cycladic islands, the sea, the Aegean Sea. I mean, it's so pedestrian, it seems almost like Pausanias is just being, is not a very sophisticated author, but I think on the contrary, he's drawing attention to how these spaces become humanized, for want of a better word, how they become part of our vocabulary by when we put a name to them, and naming is going to be so important for the rest of the text. Other issues might include, well, how granular do you want to be? So, okay, we can kind of identify these places, okay, Sunion, Attica as a region, a territory. The Greek, that's an issue. And if you notice up here, I didn't annotate Greek. Here I did, that's a choice. So I did find a gazetteer entry in Pleiades, Hellas, and in the end I went for that. But it's a question, I think, in Pausanias. What's Greek actually? What counts as Greek? And you can see just in this opening line here, Pausanias setting up the rest of his work. In fact, you know, Will Hutton's already mentioned, recognized this, where in fact he ends it in that first line with Attica, and that's in fact the headline for this whole book. But how granular do you want to be? Well, a harbour, yeah, we can assert that. Even the point on Sunion, the temple there. What about the point on the point, the Coryphaea? Here, I couldn't find a gazetteer entry. I mean, and so Pausanias is challenging you to really locating yourself in the space. You see some different color coding here. This is to identify the addressee. So we shift, in fact, from what you might think of as a synoptic view of space, so kind of a bird's eye view or God's eye view, if you will, of the Greek mainland and the islands and Sunion and Attica, to shifting through the addressee to a hodological view. Suddenly we're on a route, we're approaching a harbour, and then the point on Sunion, so we can imagine ourselves coming around the cape. That raises some issues, however, because if you follow the order, first of all, he mentions the Nios of Athena at Sunion. Okay, important temple. What about the temple of Poseidon? Not there. So one issue here is what's Pausanias leaving out. That's I think a real challenge, and potentially really fascinating if we can compare Pausanias' representation to these other data resources that I've talked about. And just that's two last things, if you will. Laurion here. If you notice, again, in the English translation, which I had annotated previously, he says, farther on is Laurion, where once the Athenians had silver mines. So what I've done with this attribution is to elide the first mention of Laurion with the silver mines. There's an entry in Pleiades, for example, for the silver mines. I've elided that, but it's not quite right if you're paying attention with the Greek. He talks about Laurion, there is Laurion, present tense, and then he shifts to the past tense, where once the Athenians had silver mines. So actually it might be better to have two different ways of describing Laurion here. One, Laurion may be a general area, and then the second mention, the Entha, which he then attributes to the silver mines, that can be that specific reference to the silver mines. And why that might be important is that otherwise the geography is a bit confused, because in fact the silver mines come after, they come before Sunion, they don't come after Sunion. So there's something weird going on with the geography. And maybe this solves it, maybe it doesn't. But nevertheless, I think it's an important distinction to make between the broad idea of Laurion and specifically when they're being used as silver mines. And this is the last point I want to make. Made at that time when Porter, the Athenians had them. So here we've moved back in time. This is a period definition. So we want to mark this as a period definition, but what kind of period? I think I was tempted initially to mark this as a 6th century, 5th century, in line with what Herodotus tells us with Themistocles and the Athenians using the silver mines. But Pausanias could tell us that. Elsewhere, he talks about Themistocles. He doesn't here. It's just when the Athenians had the silver mines, implying maybe, now of course they don't. And why is that the case? Because the Athenians no longer have hegemony. You know, they're just part of the Roman Empire. Another very important aspect when we're reading Pausanias. So what period do we assign this? Well, certainly we want to avoid dates. I think Dennis Feeney has instructed us very well about the problematics of importing our own dating system here. So we want to try and think of periods that Pausanias himself uses. But it's a bit of a headache, to be perfectly honest. To end with, on a happier note, going back to Pelagios, is that Pelagios, and I was very careful not to call it a project before, but it was a project before. It was a core team with core funding, is now a network association. A network association of equal and interdependent partners. Essentially, anybody can join Pelagios now to take a role in organizing the community based around common interests in digital humanities and specifically georeferencing. So everything that might imply, from annotation to collaboration to gazetteers to pedagogy to registry to visualization. So these are the different activities, the way that we've kind of chunked up Pelagios. And this is an appeal, really. If you're interested in if you're working in this space, then we would love to hear from you, and we would love to welcome you as partners to the Pelagios network so that we can continue to work together to provide sources and resources to folks in the community. And here's just a bunch of website information that I'm very happy to share with Anka so that she can then share with you after this talk. But now you're going to hear from Brady. So thanks very much.